Dog won't leave a car accident scene. The reason why will touch your heart. The rain poured relentlessly, hammering down on the windshield like 1,000 tiny fists. The highway was dark, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow the world whole. Headlights from passing cars streaked through the rain, creating ghostly trails in the foggy air. Amid this chaotic backdrop, a lone car stood skewed on the side of the road, its front end crumpled like paper. Steam hissed from the engine, mingling with the rain as if the car itself were breathing its last breath. A faint whimper pierced through, the sound of the storm. There in the shadows beside the wreckage stood a dog, a golden retriever drenched to the bone, his fur clinging to his shivering frame. His eyes, wide and filled with a mixture of fear and determination, were fixed on the crumpled car. He paced back and forth, his paws splashing in puddles, his tail low and still. Inside the car, the airbag had deployed, and the faint glow of the interior light revealed a man slumped over the steering wheel. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, staining his shirt. The dog barked once sharply, as if trying to rouse the unconscious man. When there was no response, the dog let out a heart-wrenching howl, the kind that made you stop whatever you were doing and pay attention. A few passing cars slowed down, their occupants craning their necks to see what was going on, but no one stopped. Perhaps they assumed help was already on the way. Perhaps they didn't want to get involved. The dog, however, refused to leave. He scratched at the door, his claws making faint screeching noises against the metal. He circled the car, barking at the empty night, his eyes darting to every passing set of headlights, as if begging for someone, anyone, to stop. Finally, the dog stopped in front of the car, standing motionless. He stared down the road as if sensing something approaching. His ears perked up and his body tensed, and then he barked again, louder this time, more urgent. It was the kind of bark that demanded attention, that refused to be ignored. In the distance, faint red and blue lights began to flicker through the rain. An ambulance was coming, its sirens muffled by the storm. The dog didn't move. He stood, his ground, barking and wagging his tail slightly as if relieved that help was finally on the way. But there was something strange about the way he kept glancing back at the car, as if there was more to the story than met the eye. As the paramedics rushed out to check on the man, the dog stayed put, watching their every move with intense focus. One of the paramedics bent down and tried to coax the dog away, but he wouldn't budge. His paws dug into the wet asphalt, his eyes pleading. It was as if he was trying to tell them something, and that's when one of the paramedics noticed it. A faint, muffled sound coming from the trunk of the car. "What's that?" the paramedic asked, freezing in place. The dog barked again, his tail wagging slightly, his gaze fixed on the back of the car. Whatever was in that trunk was the reason he refused to leave. But what could it be? What was the dog so desperate to protect? And why had he stayed behind in the pouring rain, risking everything to keep watch over the scene? The paramedics exchanged glances, their faces shadowed by a mix of confusion and unease. One of them crouched near the dog, his gloved hand outstretched cautiously, while the other moved toward the trunk. The golden retriever barked again, urgent and sharp, as if guiding them to act quickly. "Easy, boy," the paramedic murmured, his voice soothing but uncertain. The dog's wet fur glistened under the red and blue lights, his entire body tense and alert. The paramedic at the trunk hesitated before lifting the latch. The rain made the metal slippery, and his gloves squeaked as he worked. Finally, with a heavy click, the trunk popped open. Inside was a duffel bag soaked in patches where the rain had seeped in. But what caught their attention wasn't the bag, it was the faint sound of crying. The paramedics froze, and the dog let out a low whine, his tail wagging weakly as if to say, "You found it, now hurry." The paramedic closest to the trunk leaned in, carefully unzipping the bag. Inside, wrapped in a thin blanket, was a baby. Tiny, fragile, and shivering from the cold, the infant's cries grew louder as the blanket fell away. The paramedics gasped, exchanging stunned looks. "Get the heater running," one of them barked, springing into action. He reached in, gently lifting the baby out of the trunk, his movements quick but careful. The golden retriever trotted closer, his nose brushing against the paramedic's leg, as if checking to make sure they were doing their job. As they rushed the baby into the ambulance, the dog followed, climbing in uninvited but determined. One of the paramedics started to protest, but the other shook his head. "Let him stay, he's not going anywhere," he said, a hint of awe in his voice. The man in the driver's seat of the wrecked car stirred, groaning softly. The paramedics glanced back. "Check him out," one of them said, still cradling the baby. "I'll take care of this little one." As one paramedic rushed to assist the man, the other wrapped the baby in a thermal blanket and placed her on a gurney. The golden retriever sat beside the baby, his head resting near her tiny hand. His eyes never left her, not even for a moment. Meanwhile, the driver's condition became clearer. He was disoriented but alive, muttering fragments of words as the paramedics tried to piece together what had happened. What's going on?" the man stammered. His eyes fluttered open, landing on the paramedic. "You were in a car accident," the paramedic explained. "We found a baby in your trunk. Do you know anything about her?" The man's eyes widened in panic and his breathing quickened. "The baby," he whispered, his voice breaking. I was taking her to the hospital. She was abandoned. I found her in a box by the side of the road." The paramedics froze for a moment, processing his words. The dog, as if understanding the gravity of the situation, let out a soft whimper. "Why didn't you call for help?" the paramedic asked, his tone laced with both frustration and sympathy. "There wasn't time," the man rasped. "She was barely breathing. I was afraid she wouldn't make it." As the pieces began to fall into place, the golden retriever's role in the story became even more astonishing. It wasn't just loyalty or instinct that kept him at the accident scene. It was something deeper, something unexplainable. As the man began to recount the events leading up to the crash, the story took a darker turn. He had spotted the baby while walking his dog late at night. Someone had left her in a flimsy box, her tiny face pale and her cries faint. Without hesitation, he had scooped her up and rushed to his car, but the road to help wasn't smooth. As he sped toward the nearest hospital, a pair of headlights had appeared in his rearview mirror. A truck, large and menacing, had begun tailing him closely, its engine roaring aggressively. "They didn't want me to take her," the man said, his voice trembling. "Who didn't?" the paramedic pressed. "I don't know," the man admitted. "But they kept following me, trying to run me off the road. I tried to lose them, but I lost control in the rain." The dog's soft growl interrupted the conversation, his ears perking up at the mention of danger. It was as if he too remembered the pursuit. "Did you see who they were?" the paramedic asked. "No," the man said, shaking his head, "but I think they knew I had her." The golden retriever's protective behavior suddenly made perfect sense. He wasn't just guarding the man or the baby. He was guarding the secret, the truth that someone had tried to silence. As the ambulance sped toward the hospital, the baby's cries softened, her tiny fingers reaching out to touch the dog's nose. He didn't flinch, only lowered his head as if to reassure her. The paramedics couldn't help but marvel at the scene. "It's like he knows," one of them whispered. And he did. He knew that this wasn't just about a car accident or a baby in need. It was about something bigger, something that couldn't be left unresolved. Inside was a duffel bag, soaked in patches where the rain had seeped in. But what caught their attention wasn't the bag. It was the faint sound of crying. The paramedics froze and the dog let out a low whine, his tail wagging weakly as if to say, "You found it, now hurry." Just as the ambulance pulled into the hospital parking lot, a dark truck rolled slowly past the entrance. The golden retriever's head shot up, his ears flat against his skull. He let out a low, guttural growl, his body stiffening like a spring ready to snap. Who were they, and why were they still watching? The golden retriever refused to budge as the baby was whisked away by hospital staff. His eyes darted from the paramedics to the dark truck that had slowly passed the hospital entrance. His growl deepened, his entire body tense with unease. It was clear he wasn't just a loyal companion. He was a protector, and his work wasn't done yet. Inside the emergency room, the baby was rushed into the care of nurses and doctors. They worked quickly to stabilize her tiny, fragile body. The paramedics stood nearby, shaken by what they'd witnessed. Meanwhile, the man from the car accident was wheeled into another room, his face pale as he muttered bits of his story to the police. "I don't know who they were," he told the officer. "I just saw the baby in a box near the woods. I couldn't. I'll leave her there. But as soon as I picked her up, that truck showed up and started chasing me. I think they were watching her." The officer frowned, scribbling notes. "Watching her? Why would someone leave a baby, then come back for her?" "I don't know," the man whispered, his voice breaking, "but I had to save her." The golden retriever barked loudly, pulling everyone's attention back to the hospital doors. Outside, the dark truck had returned, idling in the parking lot with its headlights still on. The officer, sensing something was off, walked toward the entrance with one hand resting on his holstered weapon. He squinted through the rain-soaked glass doors, trying to make out the faces of the people inside the truck. But before he could step outside, the truck's engine roared to life, and it sped away into the night. "Whoever they are, they're not done," the officer muttered under his breath. The golden retriever trotted up beside him, his fur damp and his expression fierce. It was as if the dog knew that the people in the truck were a threat. As the hours passed, the baby's condition improved. She had been severely dehydrated and cold, but thanks to the quick actions of the paramedics and the man who saved her, she would recover. But something didn't sit right with the officer. He decided to revisit the site where the man had found the baby. He brought the golden retriever along, figuring the dog might help uncover something important. The rain had stopped by the time they reached the wooded area near the highway. The officer scanned the scene with his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The golden retriever sniffed the ground, his tail low and his ears alert. Suddenly, the dog stopped. He began pawing at the earth near a large tree, whining softly. The officer knelt down, brushing away the wet leaves and dirt. That's when he found it, a small torn piece of paper. The ink had smudged from the rain, but the words were still legible. Delivered to... The rest of the note was missing. But it was enough to confirm one thing. Someone had left the baby on purpose, and they were expecting someone else to retrieve her. Back at the hospital, the man who had saved the baby was sitting up in bed, talking to the police. He described the chase in more detail, emphasizing how relentless the truck's driver had been. "They weren't trying to scare me," he said. "They were trying to stop me. They didn't care if I crashed." Inside was a duffel bag, soaked, in patches where the rain had seeped in. But what caught their attention wasn't the bag. It was the faint sound of crying. The paramedics froze, and the dog let out a low whine, his tail wagging weakly, as if to say, "You found it. Now hurry." The officer returned with the torn note, his expression grim. "This wasn't an accident," he said. "That baby wasn't abandoned. She was part of something bigger." "What do you mean?" the man asked. "I think she was being trafficked," the officer replied. "Someone was supposed to pick her up and you got in the way." The room fell silent. The golden retriever, lying at the foot of the bed, let out a soft whimper, his eyes fixed on the man. As the pieces of the puzzle came together, one thing became clear. The golden retriever had been more than just a passive witness. He had been the one to alert the man to the baby in the first place. The man explained how his dog had dragged him toward the box in the woods, barking furiously, until he finally followed. "I don't know how he knew," the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "But he saved her." The officer nodded, his respect for the dog evident. "He didn't just save her, he saved you too. If you hadn't gotten her out of there, who knows what would have happened." Just as they thought the mystery was solved, the hospital received a call. A witness had seen the dark truck near the woods earlier that night, and it wasn't alone. There had been another vehicle, a smaller car with tinted windows, parked nearby. The officer's phone buzzed with an update from his team. They had tracked the truck to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. "I think we just found where they were planning to take her," he said, his voice tight with urgency. The golden retriever stood up, his ears perked and his tail wagging slightly. It was as if he knew the fight wasn't over yet. The officer didn't waste time. With backup on the way, he headed toward the warehouse, bringing the golden retriever with him. The man, still weak from the crash, stayed behind at the hospital, anxiously waiting for news. At the warehouse, the officer and his team moved in cautiously. The golden retriever led the way, his nose to the ground and his body tense. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil and decay. Suddenly, the dog barked, his sharp, echoing yelp breaking the silence. The officers followed him to a locked room. After forcing the door open, they found what they had feared, evidence of a human trafficking operation. Crates, papers, and items meant for transportation lay scattered across the room, but there was no sign of the people involved. They had fled, leaving everything behind. Although the traffickers escaped, the evidence was enough to shut down their operation and start an investigation. The golden retriever became a local hero, praised for his bravery and instincts. The baby, now safe and recovering, was placed in the care of social services, with a line of families already hoping to adopt her. As for the man, he knew his life had changed forever. Sitting on the hospital bed with his loyal dog at his side, he realized just how lucky they had been to find her and to survive. The first rays of sunlight broke through the dense forest, bathing the crash site in a soft, golden glow. The once chaotic scene was now quiet, with just the faint hum of rescue vehicles in the distance. Max lay beside the stretcher carrying Anna, his body finally still, his loyal eyes never leaving her face. His fur was matted with dirt, his paws scratched from his relentless efforts through the night. Yet he looked content, as if knowing his job was done. Anna's parents stood beside the stretcher, their faces a mixture of relief and gratitude. They gently patted Max, whispering words of thanks. The paramedics too couldn't help but admire the dog's courage. If it weren't for him, one of them said, we might not have found her in time. As Anna was carefully loaded into the ambulance, Max tried to follow. His tail wagged weakly, but his determination to stay by her side was stronger than his exhaustion. A paramedic smiled and nodded, lifting him gently into the vehicle. I think this hero deserves to come along. At the hospital, Anna's condition stabilized. Though she was weak and covered in bruises, her first request upon waking was, "Where's Max?" When they brought him to her bedside, his ears perked up and his tail thumped softly against the floor. Anna's eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "You saved me, Max. You didn't give up." The days that followed were a whirlwind of recovery and reunions. Anna's story spread through the town, and soon it was featured on local news. Max was hailed as a hero, his photo plastered across newspapers and social media. But for Anna and her family, he was more than just a hero. He was family. On the day Anna returned home, a small crowd of neighbors and friends had gathered to welcome her back. Max trotted proudly beside her wheelchair, a shiny new collar around his neck, a gift from a local animal rescue group. As the family thanked everyone for their support, Anna knelt down to hug Max tightly. "You never left me," she said, her voice breaking, "and I'll never leave you." In the weeks that followed, Anna and Max became inseparable. Whether it was short walks in the garden or quiet evenings by the fireplace, their bond grew even stronger. Max's eyes always held a knowing look, as if he understood just how much he had done for her. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset, Anna turned to her parents. "I think Max and I were meant to find each other. He wasn't just a stray, he was my guardian angel." Her father nodded, smiling at the loyal dog lying at her feet. "Sometimes, the ones we think are lost find us in ways we never expect, and in that moment, as the golden light bathed them in warmth, it was clear that Max and Anna had found something truly special, a bond that would never be broken."